I'm so glad that you could make it on this cold night. My name's Susan Stinson. I'm the writer-in-residence at Forbes Library, and this is the Local History, Local Novelist series. If you want to know more about this series, well, I should tell you that next month is a celebration of local novelists with Zane Kotker, Joanne Coben, who is here tonight, Roger King, and Corinne Dimas. And there's flyers for that event on the glass bookcase over there. There's also a flyer about the whole series. It happens once a month through May, and it'd be great if you could come to other events. And I should also tell you that over on the glass case, it's very generous. Dr. Thelwell brought Prophet is Not Without Honor, a piece that he's written about James Baldwin, and as long as they last, you're welcome to take one if you're a member of the audience. So take advantage of that generosity. So tonight is an evening inspired by James Baldwin, and we'll hear some about Baldwin's work. And then some of the readers will not be reading to you primarily about James Baldwin. They are reading and performing work that is interesting in conversation with and sometimes directly inspired by his work. You know, James Baldwin is what I'm going to go ahead and call a genius, a novelist, playwright, and essayist of great lyricism and power. His work also has almost unthinkable compassion and courage. His work is a tremendous influence in cultural conversations around race. His literary explorations of sexuality, including what some of us might now call queerness, has also inspired many of us, including me. He lived as an expatriate, primarily in Paris, for much of his life. He also taught at UMass in Amherst in the 80s. And 2013 marks the 50th anniversary of the publication of his brilliant book, The Fire Next Time. And I was reading this morning his notes for his play, Blues for Mr. Charlie, and read that he had traveled in Mississippi with Medgar Evers to look into the murder of a black man by a white storekeeper before Medgar Evers himself was killed. And Baldwin wrote of his play, "We are in a terrible darkness here, and this is one man's attempt to bear witness to the reality and power of light." So, 3 speakers tonight: Ekwemi Michael Thelwell, Mistinguett Smith, and Linnell Moise. And we're going to start with Ekwemi Michael Thelwell, who said he didn't want an introduction. Why waste time with that?
Thank you, Ms. Stimson, and I thank you for this invitation to speak about Jimmy, one of the most influential people in my life and in the life of a whole generation of Americans. It's always a pleasure to talk about him. And I forewent the ego-stroking of an introduction so I could use the time in a way unrelated to the subject. Today is exactly a month to the day that I underwent a surgical procedure here in Northampton, which is of no relevance to the subject tonight. But we live in an age where everything seems literally to be degenerating, where nothing seems to work, where things are non-functional. You merely have to look at the behavior of the American Congress and the White House over the last 4 days to know what I mean by dysfunction. So it is always, and it's reached a point where I've declined speaking engagements because I feel guilty about standing before audiences, particularly audiences of youth, to describe the terrible straits in which I see the country. What's that got to do with my little digression here? Well, for that reason, it's always a great pleasure when one sees something working better than advertised. And I'm talking about an institution which is a Northampton institution. Before I underwent this surgery, which is not properly called surgery, it properly could be described as carpentry. But before, it's a knee replacement. I had to visit Cooley Dickers several times where they taught us what was going to happen, they explained what was happening to us, and they answered every possible question you could have in a very intelligent and thoughtful way. And during the procedure and until I left the hospital, I was immensely, immensely impressed by the professionalism, the kindness, the courtesy, the consideration that everybody I encountered in that institution displayed. But that wouldn't have been enough for me to say anything about it. But at the same time I was there was a lady who died. And her family came from all over the country. And I was speaking to a member of her family who himself is a nurse, a registered nurse in California. And literally the first words out of that man's mouth was, "What an extraordinary institution Cooley Dick is. I've never seen them, any institution take as much care, be as considerate of my mother, be as considerate of the family. This really is unusual in my experience." And he was really taken aback by it. So having my impression confirmed by this professional impression, I didn't want to come to Northampton and leave without paying courtesy and tribute to an extraordinary institution which you should be proud of and support. That was my introduction. In the private chambers of the soul, the guilty party is identified. And the accusing finger there is not legend, but consequence, not fantasy, but the truth. People pay for what they do, and still more for what they have allowed themselves to become. And they pay for it simply by the lives they lead. You probably have no doubt about who I'm quoting. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it must always be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we have got in all this darkness. And this tale has another aspect in every country and a new depth in every generation. That also is our brother Jimmy. I'm going to use what time I have very generally to talk about Jimmy's impact, Jimmy's place, and the role his life, presence, witness, and work commands in American culture and history. You can hear me, ma'am?
Thank you. If you could speak a little louder, that would be very helpful.
Well, I try to be as helpful as I can.
Thank you.
And I'm going to do it in an unusual way. It won't be a formal, structured essay on Jimmy Baldwin's accomplishment. I'm going to talk about his effect on me and personalizing it through a narrative, because his effect on me wasn't that different from its effect on all my friends, people of my generation, and his effect on a whole generation of Americans. Later in his life, when he came to teach at the university, I would sometimes accompany him to speaking engagements. And I remember when we went to Harvard, this middle-aged gentleman came rushing out and said, "Mr. Baldwin, Mr. Baldwin, when I read The Fire Next Time, it changed my life." And people of that generation, a young man from South Africa saying, "I read Nobody Knows My Name in jail in South Africa, and that book sustained and strengthened all of us who was in jail. We smuggled it from cell to cell." And the testimony of people who saw Jimmy as changing their life in that generation was really quite extraordinary, but not unexpected. Can you hear me now, ma'am? Are you? All right, good. My introduction to James Baldwin was really quite remarkable. I was a sophomore at Howard University, a black school in Washington, D.C. The year was 1962, And I was involved with a group of people there, the Nonviolent Action Group, students, white and black from the other schools, who are vigorously involved in pursuing sit-ins, demonstrations, and supporting the Southern Civil Rights Movement. One of our members, Tom Kahn, a white guy from New York, very politically sophisticated. He was Bayard Rustin's roommate and had come to Howard, very politically involved, War Resisters League, Young People's Socialist Alliance, and so forth, and had come to Howard with a mandate to kind of try to help organize and direct a student movement at the black school in the nation's capital. He came into my room and said, "Does the name James Baldwin mean anything to you?" And I said, "Vaguely. He's a black and he's a writer, isn't he?" He said, "Okay, that will soon change because he's coming to town. He'll be here next week. Read this." And he handed me Go Tell It on a Mountain. And I said, "Well, why should I be so concerned about this guy's coming?" He said, "Because he is the most extraordinary human being you will ever meet." I said, "Tell me about it." He said, "Well, first of all, he's this wizened-looking little black man, almost gnomish, with the most big protruding eyes you ever saw. And his emotional life is always in a state of chaos. He lives teetering on the verge of emotional chaos." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah. But when he opens his mouth, you will be engulfed in the most articulate, the most persuasive, the most intelligent, and the most eloquent thought and language that you've ever encountered. It would be really quite extraordinary." So naturally, I ran off to read Go Tell It on a Mountain, and we had a discussion of that. But I remember Tom's words almost exactly, because I don't think anybody has ever been described in preparation to your meeting them in words which are, first of all, so accurate and which played themselves out in the course of the next 30 or 40 years of my life. Jimmy had just returned from France. And he had returned from France because he had 2 books which would be coming out: the novel Another Country and the collection of essays Nobody Knows My Name. And he had returned with his publishers to promote this. And that's why he was in Washington. Now, he was speaking the next evening in Georgetown. Georgetown then and now was a precinct of the powerful and the wealthy, and the would-be powerful and wealthy in Washington. In 1962, almost a totally white precinct. And Jimmy, and you might forgive the irony, was speaking in the home of a wealthy socialist who apparently didn't see any contradiction. And the house was extraordinary because it was one huge space, and the rooms were along the walls. So there was a big rail, maybe 15 feet, and the bedrooms and all along the walls. But the floor of this place itself was a huge space where people could gather. And myself and some people, Cleve Sellers, Stokely Carmichael, Cortland Cox, and maybe 10 or 12 other black people from Howard, students active in the movement, went into the pretty much all-white province of Georgetown to get there. We couldn't afford cabs, so we went on foot, and of course, in keeping with the traditions of our people, got there a little bit late. And we entered a door into this large room of white America. These are progressives, these are socialists, but there's just totally white people. And Jimmy was already speaking. And he looked up as this 10, 12 young black people walking. And this beautiful, charismatic smile of his, which is very famous, crossed his, and he looked at us and says, "Ah, there you are. I am so very happy you came." And we walked in. And every word Tom said about eloquence, about articulateness, about intelligence, and about directness was true. What we witnessed that evening was Jimmy Baldwin encountering white America. And this wasn't mid-America, and this wasn't racist America, this was progressive white America. But white America nonetheless, on the question of the racial circumstance of the country. And you really would have to be of that generation to understand what the language and the attitudes disguised, not even disguised, the attitudes conveyed by that language meant about how black people were seen in terms of their relationship to white society and their place in America. I mean, we're accustomed to hear ourselves described as a Negro problem. I mean, that was the way the media and academy discussed the Negro problem. And if they were being polite, the Negro question, or the Negro subculture. It was all disparaging. It was all reductive. It was all mistaken. And it was all predicated on a very strong, ill-disguised, intellectual white supremacy. And that was how you're accustomed to hearing yourself described. And we stood there in that wealthy space in Georgetown and watched Jimmy Baldwin cut every one of those myths and projections into shreds, completely demolishing all the attitudes. And you stood there and said, oh my God, all the assumptions of these people, all the projections of these people, the very form, structure, and shape of the dialogue is changing. And literally, without exaggerating, you could stand there and feel the intellectual underpinnings, the foundation on which all the discourse on race in this country was built. You could feel it shift. And these people, progressive though they undoubtedly were very upset because their worldview, the natural order they were accustomed to operating in, was being demolished in front of their eyes. That's number one. Number two, it was being demolished by somebody black. And number three, it was being demolished in terms so absolutely accurate, so absolutely eloquent, so absolutely precise, that they couldn't argue with it. Though, of course, there are some who are going to try. And well, do you happen to be saying, and Jimmy, I wish I could, I mean, I still even remember some of the arguments and some of Jimmy's responses, but I don't have time to go into them. So that was my first real encounter with how true Tom Kahn's description of Jimmy's role and function was. The first thing I ever published was an essay. Jules Stremetsky will probably remember it, James Baldwin, Native Alien. I showed it to you in Motive magazine when I came here. I was a sophomore in college. But the effect Jimmy had on me was that he inspired me to write. And he became, for me, as well as for any number of other people, the image of what a black writer should be. And I've said other places where I've written, somebody was sneering at Jimmy because of his sexuality. And somebody was Stanley Crouch, who is a paid-up, know-nothing, and imbecile. And he was sneering at Jimmy's sexuality. And I wrote back and said, you know, I'm trying to remember his name, a friend of mine, the guy who wrote Man-Child in the Promised Land, Claude Brown, who's also from Harlem, told me the story. He said, I was in this bar, and some guy started saying some of the same kinds of things that Stanley Crouch was saying about Jimmy. Jimmy was on television doing something, and started calling him faggot and gay and so. And Claude said, this huge black man just loomed up from in the background and grabbed the sucker around his neck and picked him up. And said, let me tell you something. I know Jimmy. That brother may be small and he may be gay, but he ain't no faggot. And never let me hear you call him that again, Marvin Brown. And I said to Claude, as I'm saying to you now, I said, look, slender, gay, gentle James Baldwin taught a generation of us how to be black men in this country. And I think there are other examples I could give you, And maybe in the question period we could do some of those, because I don't want to encroach on anybody else's time. But there's one story I'll leave you with. We were, as I say, politically very active and intellectually very active. By we, I mean my colleagues at Howard. So we had a program called Project Awareness to foster the political education of the general campus body. And we had one program called The Responsibility of the Black Writer. We invited a number of people. Ralph Ellison declined to come, to nobody's great surprise. But Jimmy came, the brother who wrote Youngblood. What's his name? Youngblood? Yeah, John Oliver Killens, whose son was at school with us. He came. Actor. Anyway, a host of very accomplished black writers came. And at the end, and Jimmy, of course, and at the end of which, Malcolm X came. We're walking through the gathering, and there was Malcolm. I said, Brother Malcolm, what are you doing here? He says, anytime that little brother speak, I'll come to listen to him, because I always learn something. And Malcolm would subsequently say to Jimmy, if I, Malcolm, am the warrior of this movement, then you are its poet. But afterwards, we decided we would repair. These guys really, the older guys, the writers, wanted to talk to us because they were very concerned about what we're doing, very concerned about what trouble we might get into, but also very proud of us. There was no generation gap. So we ended up in a student apartment, sending people out from time to time to buy bootleg liquor, because liquor stores closed at 9 o'clock in D.C. on the street corner. And we're talking to these guys about the movement, about the Kennedy administration, about the war in Vietnam, about the responsibility of young black people, about the responsibility of black rights, until the sun came up. And just as the sun was coming up, Jimmy got up. We had talked about every subject to death. And we were just delighted to be there with these guys. And they were very, very fraternal and very protective and very respectful of us, even though we were very young. And Jimmy summarized the spirit of the occasion. But also it was a pledge, as you will hear, that he honored till he drew his last breath. And Jimmy said, very well, my young brothers and sisters, here we are. He says, I, as a black writer, represent you in some way. I must always do so. Now, you never elected me, and I never asked for it, but there we are. That is the reality. He says, but now I will make a pledge to you. He says, if you promise me that you will never accept any of the pejorative, degenerating, insulting, what was the stereotypes? Categories that this society has prepared for you, then I promise you that I, James Baldwin, will never betray you. And he never did. And he saw himself consistently as a protector of our generation, as a spokesman for our generation, and as a representative of the black community, of black culture, and the black perspective in this country. Now, as I said to you, the occasion of his coming back was for the publication of 2 new books. He had been out of sight for a while. He had published Go Tell It on a Mountain. He had published the essays Notes of a Native Son. And he had published very courageously and against the advice of his agent and his publisher and everybody else, Giovanni's Room. And they felt that to publish a book that was set in a gay community and in a gay ambience, openly so, without disguising it, was entirely too risky and too bold for this young black man from Harlem with only a high school education and not a penny to his name. It would destroy his career. And they were probably right in having that concern. And Jimmy just turned around, published the book in Europe, brought it back to America, because he never would conform to any of the expectations that the traditional majority, the establishment, had for him, which is one of the reasons why he has been so traduced and abused in the establishment literary media since his death. He came back to publish Another Country, which is a book I would recommend to you all, a novel I would recommend to you all, which became an incredible bestseller. But it certainly alienated and antagonized the literary establishment, and particularly the New Yorkers intellectuals, and you are familiar with that term. I saw Jimmy on the street. He was getting out of a cab. I'd driven past my subway stop 5 times one night, reading Another Country. I lived in Brooklyn, got on in Manhattan. Next thing I know, I didn't know where I was. Crossed the tracks, got on again. Next thing I know, I was back in Manhattan. I mean, that happened 5 times. And so I ran up to him and said, Mr. Baldwin, how is the book doing? He said, well, it's a bestseller. It's doing very, very well everywhere except New York. He said the reviews all over the country are very, very encouraging. But in New York, they have been absolutely vicious. I don't understand it. Later on, when Jimmy came to live in Amherst, we had many occasions to sit down at night talking, and it was very clear to me, if he really didn't understand it that day we met in New York, he fully understood it by the time he got to Amherst. But with that book, and the second book of essays, which is also extraordinarily powerful and eloquent, and I recommend it to you, Nobody Knows My Name, and with the rise in pressure and the percolating upwards of black resentment and black aspirations and a full-fledged movement in this country, the conjunction of author and time was perfect. And Jimmy commanded an audience, commanded a platform from which he could address the American public in the most extraordinary, far-reaching way. Frederick Douglass never had that kind of technology. Dr. Du Bois never had it. This was the first black voice that commanded the full attention of the nation. And Jimmy did not allow the importunities and the pressures of various forces in the society and the publishing world to win him away from what he saw as his responsibility. His witness and his testimony couldn't be suborned and would not be mitigated. Jimmy told the truth. As he used to say, we must tell the truth till we can bear it no more. And the role he played in helping America to a clearer understanding of itself and to the role and presence of race in American society is unmatched. I think I've taken too much time, so I won't tell you about an incident which gave graphic evidence of the role that Jimmy commanded to the reading audience in this country, but maybe later on I'll have that occasion. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, his witness and his testimony could not be suborned, it would not be mitigated. He told the truth. Goodness. When Miss Stingett-Smith began to notice that black people think and talk about their relationship to land and place quite differently from the ways mainstream institutions do, the Black Land Project was born. As the founder and director of the Black Land Project, she has traveled the country gathering black people's stories about relationship to southern farmland, urban cityscapes, changing neighborhoods, and public green spaces since the fall of 2010. Blending her literary ear as a poet and playwright with her professional knowledge of women's health, food security, and leadership development for social equity, Smith turns the gift of individual stories into a body of information that engages and heals Black communities. Smith is a skilled analyst, trainer, and facilitator, and a masterful speaker who captivates both academic and community audiences. A graduate of Smith College, she holds the MPA in Public and Nonprofit Management from New York University. She was the 2011 Twink Frey Visiting Scholar Activist at the University of Michigan Center for the Education of Women. Ms. Tinget is a gift to write and think with, and I'm so happy that she's reading tonight.
So what I'd like to share with you tonight are some excerpts from a work in progress, which feels a little bit risky. But I want to begin by saying that James Baldwin is part of the always, already of my life. The very first book I was ever forbidden to read was The Fire Next Time. And thus I was introduced to the epistolary essay, which has become a form that I love. And also my ability to think about Black people as a people who think critically and live critically. Out of that has been born my work with the Black Land Project, which interviews Black people across the country about their relationship to land and place, and develops analysis about what that relationship is. I've been trying to write about some of those stories, and I'm going to share some of that with you tonight. With pieces from an essay that is a riposte to my Dungeon Shook letter to my nephew on the 100th anniversary of emancipation, the essay that opens The Fire Next Time. This essay is called Just When I Thought That I Was Lost. And if you know that song, you can sing it at the end. 31 December 2012. Dear James, it is watch night, that annual rite marking our place in the darkness, turning toward a new kind of light. It is a ritual of quiet approach, bundling and rustling through the dry December cold, ice crackling underfoot beneath unseen stars. Fewer each year, we faithful sit in long pews and folding chairs, facing the pulpit and waiting for the change we know is going to come. The silence is ancient. We've been sitting this way every New Year's Eve for 150 years. Soon, somebody will line out a song. The rest of us will ease into a response in minor harmony. We've come to celebrate Freedom Eve, waiting together for Jubilee, emancipation, the hour when freedom finally comes. We remake it together in the year's final hour to celebrate the moment when our dungeons shook and our chains fell off. We mark the end of a suffering no living soul remembers. We clap and mark time as if we could ever forget. It is watch night. And instead of paying attention, I am scribbling in an unlined notebook with the only pen I can find. This is your fault, Mr. Baldwin. Your fault that I write this way, sitting up in church writing. Writing what I'm afraid of forgetting, writing what I long and fear to confess. To write is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. Isn't that what you said? And it is dangerous to take our family business outside the house like this, where other folks can look at it in the sharp light of day. 50 years ago, you wrote to your namesake nephew about how to claim a freedom of which you could barely dream. You wanted him to understand the past upon whose shoulders he would have to someday stand, and how love could make us see ourselves more clearly on some future uncloudy day. Yet 50 years later, so much has changed. Even the face of love has changed. So Why am I scribbling in the chill of watch night? Where is the joy in this jubilee? I await the arrival of freedom tonight, hoping some part of it will spill out of this pen and across the page. For those who don't know, an exegesis of Jubilee. The biblical great Sabbath of Jubilee, named in Leviticus as the pause after 7 cycles of 7 years, was a call to celebration of land and place. The enslaved were not simply set free, but given freedom to make the long journey to their home and be reunited in the place of their clan. Fields were left fallow to rest and to remind us that land and our place on it comes as a gift, not a guarantee. Jubilee is rejoicing in having somewhere to call home. It is the journey of return and the joy of arrival at a place to rest. Now, some Black folks say that we are still awaiting our Jubilee, that we have no homeland and the United States is not our home. They tell me that my call for a celebration of our relationship to land and place is premature. Just 50 years ago, even you wrote that we were celebrating 100 years of freedom 100 years too soon. I know you meant that freedom could not live under the old Jim Crow of lynching and segregation and bankrupt integration. Plenty of folks say we remain unfree, yoked in place by the new Jim Crow of prisons and resegregation and the bullet point lynchings of stand your ground. But we have also made a new country on this old bloody soil, James, and we have many new stories to tell. They are not the old strident and tedious lamentations. These are stories of the same land made a new place. A Black land story. Joan Southgate's feet know the shape of arrival. In her 80th year, she felt called to walk down a fugitive history, the northern stretch of the Underground Railroad, 250 miles from the Ohio River to her home in Cleveland, and another 200 miles across upstate New York to St. Catharines, Ontario. So there I was, doing my usual walk, which was a stroll, and my brain was complaining, oh, I gotta get out here every day. I have to lose this weight, blah, 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 blah. And then something said, as my mother would say, something said, your ancestors walked hundreds of miles walking for freedom. And here I am complaining about this. Immediately it came to me, how can I praise them? And the answer I heard clearly was, walk. After training by walking her neighborhood with the company of her black cat, Nelson Mandela, Joan began to retrace a route on the Underground Railroad. She began her journey in Ripley, Ohio, where freedom seekers crossed the Ohio River because so few African Americans know that story. Ohio has more Underground Railroad sites than almost all the other free states put together. That meant I could go anywhere, says Joan. I went to Springboro, Ohio, because that was a town where a whole group of Quakers had specifically settled to build a stop on the Underground Railroad. Alone on foot, hitching a ride, or being joined by media and crowds of fellow travelers for part of the road, the walk changed Southgate's ideas about Ohio as a place. I never understood that those people were not slaves. What they were brave freedom seekers, and they were met all over, in white towns and black towns, and being hidden in hay wagons on country roads, by people offering hospitality. That's how I describe what land means to me now. A place where people can seek freedom, and a place where free people can offer hospitality. I'd never thought about Ohio and New York that way before. I wonder if my ancestors came down from Canada to New York for that. This Jubilee journey is complicated. It requires us to remember that our ancestors who walked out of slavery from Alabama to Canada and then back across the border to Ohio and New York were choosing to be Americans. It demands remembering that our parents fled the Carolina fields to become working-class exiles in the motor cities of the North, and also that our children have made great migrations of return, going home to build Black gated communities atop Confederate bones in Stone Mountain, Georgia. It is complicated. Once again, James, most Black people live in the South, but it is not the South your father fled. It is far more complicated. And with our coming and leaving, our walking and dreaming, we have longed for and loved, owned and been owned by, cared for and hated this land. So the Black Land Project is about Black people's relationship to land, but there's an assumption that people often have about what that means. So I'd like to just conclude with a little piece about that. It makes me so nervous to say land. I know the first thing people think of is woodlands or farmland, as if cities and suburbs and small towns float on water. And you know how much America loves the idea of Black people's relationship to land being somewhere down south, happily working on the farm. Even we have become part of the current American back to the land craze, James. We now have Black folks with enough distance from poor and country to have an imaginary pastoral. I say Black relationships to land, and young people conjure up some filmy memory of a farm with a mule. They've never heard of John Deere. I hear people buying a farm come alive with their mother's memory of a tiny zinc-roofed house with no pipe water in rural Jamaica. African Americans who have never met a fire ant or a copperhead root online for records of property that they might be entitled to as an ancestral heir. They dream of transplanting their Brooklyn backyard garden love to acres of row crops, some imaginary where. Just 2 generations away, and we have already forgotten and romanticized the South. Even you, James, talked about the Great Migration as leaving the land, as if we owed some special loyalty to the land which law and custom and violence once held us bound. But what happens when Black people define our own relationship to urban land and remembered place? What does freedom look like when we call a new place home? A Black land story. Walter Lee Whidbey lived in the house on the corner of Damon Street for 42 years. He also owned 5 adjacent properties, building a reputation in Flint, Michigan for being a man who didn't wait for a government program to stabilize housing loss on his block. A retired GM factory worker, Mr. Whidbey knew the importance of land. He grew up in that Black Southern tradition where land holds history, and care for the history of that land builds relationships that endure. It is how we know who we are. He also knew that ownership by deed was the only way that America would respect his family's right to place. Well, in North Carolina, we lived on a sharecropper's plantation. We lived across the street from the plantation owner. And he still had all these little slave houses that were still up when we grew up there. The house that we lived in, it was built in the slave era too. The kitchen separated from the main part of the house and everything. You know what I mean. And everybody worked on this man's farm. So when I graduated from high school, I said, I'm gonna find me a job other than the farm. Because there was always some controversy with that man who owned the property. When my stepfather went and worked on the railroad, the man who owned our house decided, well, we're going to tear this house down. And we're going to make a field where they can grow corn or whatever. And it was such a nice spot to me. And I said, if I ever move, I'm going to own the next place I stay. Mr. Whidbey gardened, grew roses, and missed many aspects of Southern life in his home on Damon Street. He bought 20 acres in Philadelphia, Mississippi, but he and his wife Viola never went back to the South to live. His land, as he called the vacant lots and rehabbed houses he purchased on Flint's North Side, his land was where he staked a claim for safety and family, his legacy in the world. Well, my kids decided it for me. I wanted somewhere where they are around me. The houses came available and we just bought them as they came available. And we moved the kids in. My oldest daughter lives right next door in the yellow house, and my baby girl lives right next to her, and the middle girl lives in the house next door. My son, he stays about 2 miles away over on Kellogg Street. His wife moved him out of the district. I didn't want them all scattered all over the place. I wanted to see them grow. I wanted to watch them grow. And even though the grandkids are around, I'm still watching them. You know what I mean? I asked God a few days ago to let me live to see the little ones that we just had 5, 6 weeks ago, whatever, to see them grow a little more. I just wanted to kind of be watchful, to make sure that nothing happens to them like it did to one of my babies. He points to a photograph of a little boy, the only child in a gallery of formal high school graduation portraits on his living room wall. The twins are up here. We had a set of twins, but he got run over. He was 6 years old. He got ran over. So I'm watching over them now. Walter Whidbey Sr. tells me a story about land as a commitment to safety and family, a difficult commitment to keep, and one too dangerous to dare in the rural South of America even today. He found that if you tend it carefully, you can grow a lot of good things on a city block, like siblings and cousins and roses and love. He watched over his land and his family until September 2012. Although a deacon at St. Mark Missionary Baptist Church, his obituary said he passed away. It would have been dishonest to use the customary phrase called safely home. People tell me I'm dangerous when I say that Black relationships to land are made of something more than agriculture, suffering, or resistance. I wonder what they will say when I tell them that these relationships are a gift from Black people to the world, telling us all how we can live the story of repair. Without these stories, we remain what you call an innocent people, still trapped in a history we do not understand. Until we understand it, until we tell these stories on terms that are our own, we cannot be released from the stories others tell about us, about who we are and who we may become. When we are more than the story of affliction and loss, our freedom no longer requires the permission of others. Listen, the new year has arrived, and with it, a call to emancipate the limits of Black land imagination. We are liberated, but this time not by angels, but by the stories we sing about ourselves. Just when I thought that I was lost, free at last, oh free at last, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off. Oh, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. Do you want to be free? Thank you.
Just talk loud enough for people to hear. Questions, responses? Anything you move to say? Yeah.
This is a trivial question for Linnell. How do you pronounce your last name?
My last name is pronounced Moise.
Something else? Nyla.
Here's a question for Ms. Vignette. And actually maybe the others could answer the same question about their own work, but what inspired you to get started with the Black Land Project? Was there an incident, or was it through your own agitation?
I was not looking to start anything. A couple of years ago, I was on a field trip to the Deep South that I took so that I could get out of work for a week while still getting paid. We were visiting several locations in Birmingham and in Wilcox County, Alabama. And the folks I was with were listening to people talk about their relationship to their town or their neighborhood or their rural community. And we reflected that the way these folks talked about their relationship to land was really different from the language that any of us use professionally. And we were from a really wide variety of backgrounds. And so I immediately started looking for somebody who had already done that research because I wanted to read it. And I couldn't find them, but in the process of asking, who's done this, who's heard this, people started to tell me their stories. And I began to notice that we don't have language to talk about relationship to land that's not ownership, for example. And we don't have words to talk about the very specific ways of creating relationship to people through land that exists in perpetuity, that is the bottom line assumption of how Black people, whether they are African American or West Indian or Afro-Latino or African immigrants, all seem to hold. And so my writing about this is my attempt to hear into being those stories and that language.
So I guess there was, the follow question was, do other people want to talk about how they got involved in their own work? I don't know. Linnell or Dr. Thelwell?
Address a question to Professor Thelwell. You mentioned the response to another country. What, as a turning point in your intellectual section, what about Bruce and Mr. Charlie?
Oh, that's a similar but a different question. And I can speak about that. I'm going to do in a minute, but if you want to investigate this question a little bit.
I have no choice. That's how I started my work.
Another country which was, as I said, very popular and very influential in this time was one step in the turning away of the literati, the literary establishment from James Baldwin. At the point when those came out, a little bit certainly after another country, and nobody knows my name, the kind of encomium that was labeled on Jimmy, the greatest prose stylish in the English language, the most important writer writing in English. I mean, he was liberally and literally acclaimed at the top of the literary heap, as defined by the literati in the establishment. But there was an element of it that objected very seriously to certain aspects of another country. And these were, I think, political objections, and objections having to do with attitudes towards sexuality, where it wasn't liberal and acceptable to come straight out and say that. So it was disguised in formal terms, the structural inadequacies, the literary inadequacies of the novel, which are really, overblown, if not absolutely nonsensical. Blues for Mr. Charlie was the next step in that progression. That came out 3 years later. And it was a play which meditated on, I now remember why you asked, now I see why you asked, which meditated on the Kill case. The young boy who was killed in Morning, Mississippi. What's his first name? Emmett Till case. And but it really is a very far-ranging and clear-spoken discussion of fundamental attitudes towards race, towards liberalism, and towards sexual violence. But it was formulated in such a way that it was almost classic theater in certain ways. And the language was certainly not toned down. I mean, the language was very clear. This was a very democratic language. It mightn't disturb anybody, no. There's a language that disturbed the audiences in the 1960s and 1964 in very different ways. And then I recall you were to play a lawyer, Professor Chinesky, when there was a production of that play in Amherst. But that play is so divided. First of all, it wasn't the kind of play that had any business, if one speaks the truth, on Broadway. Broadway is just a commodification and a commercialization of a certain kind of very superficial entertainment, which is such a corporate people who will buy huge tickets, expensive tickets to take their clients to. It's a commodification of theater, and it's the cheapening of it. Bruce Mr. Child was serious. And it divided the theater community. There were some critics, and there are some elements of the community who really praised the play as a powerful development and a level of theater which Baldwin was not accustomed to, and which was probably healthy for American theater as a whole. But the rest of them, and I could name names, had some of the most nasty, dismissive, racist kinds of things to say about why this wasn't theater, why this was theater, no business here. And always coupled with an attack on Jimmy. Later back there, I asked something about your work. This story I'm about to say has something about the opposite, what would drive you away from a certain kind of literary work. I was young at the time, and quotes unquote discovered, and I was invited to New York to a very high-level literary luncheon. An editor of the New Yorker was here, the editor of the Southern Review was here, and a very influential lady who was an agent. And she had elected us as my agent. She was going to handle me, as she put it. And I said, handle me. She said, I mean your work. And they had a program for me. I would write 2 stories. I published at that time, I published Uber was 3 stories which had won prizes in the Story Magazine College Writing Contest. And the essay on Jimmy. That's my total Uber, right? So we have lunch in this expensive literary restaurant in New York. At the end of which it was decided that I would write 2 stories which would be published in the Southern Review, the festival. The agent would get me a contract to write a novel. And the editor from the New Yorker had a friend who had a house in some Italian city where I didn't speak the language, so I would have to work. It was an apartment, and they sent me there for 6 months to live in this apartment. And I would, first of all, write the 2 short stories, then I would write the novel. And my career would be launched. And it sounded very much like clientelism to me. But what really triggered the response, my response, I mean, I was feeling, on the one hand, you're flattered to be discovered and they say how talented you are. On the other hand, you're worried about these people making plans for you, you know. But that's what when the lady said, very good, then it's all settled. I haven't said yes to anything. I I think this country is ready for a new black writer. A new black writer. And I'm in this country 3 years from the West Indies. I'm going to be the new black writer. But what really made the case was when she said, this country is ready for a new black writer. Really, that James Baldwin is finished. Did you see Blues for Mr. Charlie? And she didn't know that I revered Jimmy. And so I just bowed, said goodbye, and went to James Foreman and said, okay, if that job in Snick is still open, I'll go work for Snick. And that's what I did.
Yeah?
I doubt that answered your question.
No, but it was a turning point, play and its reception.
Oh, yeah.
New York by critics. White.
There's a
The
controversy.
fact that 50% of the audience had the biggest black audiences of any play in the world.
Yeah, they had more black people attending Broadway theater than ever before, and since in the history of Broadway. But the elements of the theatrical establishment that was deeply insulted by the play, and the literary establishment, you could see a sea change in the kind of language, in the kinds of attitudes, in the way they discussed Jimmy's work. And they made themselves very clear about it, that they were going to read him out of the canon of American literature because he was so ungrateful in Negro. Like, you know. I discussed some of that in that essay, probably not without on if anybody is interested.
I see another question.
I'm curious to know if James Baldwin's work and your own work have been translated into other languages, and Spanish in particular, and if there is, and how these writings have affected the Afro movement in Latin America.
My work has been translated into some languages, but unfortunately Spanish is not one of them. Jimmy's work is widely translated, and I've been asked to be able to tell you the list, the book list, but I'm sure that a lot of it is in fact translated in Spanish. And the second part of the question, the extent to which it might have influenced Afro-Latin discourse and consciousness, I don't know. Except that I do know, I mean I don't know any specific case, but I do know that whenever I'm around Latin people, or in the literary interest also, they always talk about Jimmy as black Latinos, talk about Jimmy as representing himself as being part of the community. That much I can say.
Needs to be much more.
Very pardon, ma'am?
Needs to have more, more cultural exchange, I think.
Well, that is a very interesting question you asked, and one that you could look into.
Other questions, responses? Carolyn.
Your comment about, one writer, one black writer, James Baldwin over the next
You didn't say one.
A.
A new black. The country is ready for a new black writer. Yeah.
And that you all had such different ways that you told the story, the way that you shared the truth. So that's like, I was reflecting on that, that's what struck me the most. And I just maybe
Well, the country's
are we blossoming?
the country's only ready for one.
What?
The country's only ready for one. They got to select one.
But so now, do you feel like now there's more ways, more channels, more voices and perspectives that can get out?
3 minutes.
So there's a wonderful lecture, also available on YouTube, by the wonderful Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie, where she talks about the danger of a single story. And that it is both dangerous for us to have a single story about who or whatever we see as the other, and it is also dangerous for us to have a single story about ourselves. One of the things that I am working very hard to do in writing about the Black Land Project is to give a wide variety of unmediated, cross-cultural Black voices so that we can hear the threads that carry across culture or through generations without me imposing that. I also thought it was really interesting when Susan told me who was going to be on the panel, that I am the only person born in America here. And that conversation is more and more part of who Black people in America are.
I guess related to that, next weekend I'm performing in New York for Astrea, the Lesbian Foundation for Justice, and the event is called Righteous, W-R-I-T-E-O-U-S, and you know, it's myself, I'm Haitian American, I'll be performing. Stacey Ann Chin, who's a Jamaican lesbian poet, will also be there. Jacqueline Woodson, African American young adult novelist, will be there reading, and you know, so there's certainly a range. You know, Astrea knows about it, right? I don't think that, you know, we get to see it in the mainstream so much, but certainly the literary community recognizes, I think, that there's not just one or you know, Black voice. But you know, but people still say things, you know, when they don't think you're paying attention. But, you know, they'll suggest that maybe I am the new, right? Like that's what, and it's, you know, that's silly.
I assume you were embracing and welcoming the fact that you're the only native born lesbian. I just wanted to make sure, because I was once doing a radio show, and it's a kind of show where they call up different people at different times, and you come in and you stay on the line. And prior to me, immediately prior to me, was my good friend Stanley Crouch. And the host starts, and next we have Professor Quentin Mike Baldwin, a stalwart of the civil rights movement. I went through a kind of long introduction that I didn't want to have here tonight. And Stanley Crouch didn't know that his microphone was open. And I heard clearly, and I believe the radio audience heard clearly, when did that nigga get off the banana boat? I said, Stanley, you know nothing native, a son of a such and such. I heard you.
And I think that came, there was a time.
And I got off the banana boat in 1959.
I think there was a time when within African American communities, Blackness only meant African American. And I think one of the things that is true from the way that our work plays off of each other tonight is that there are many voices inside of Blackness, there are many ethnicities inside of Blackness, in the same way that there are of these other racialized concepts. And so our existence together begins to ask questions about the nature of race simply by listening to us speak with one another.
And in a variety of voices, my particular interest is in the similarities, not the differences. Because there are Black people from the continent, there are Black people from the area, but there is a persistence of cultural language and cultural imagery and cultural sensitivity that tends to be dismissed in the know-nothing discourse of so-called intellectuals nowadays who talk about, what's that term of disparagement they have? Essentialism. Well, there is something essential about Black people, I'm here to tell you. And it can be described, and it can be recognized. I was once hung over in the Paris airport, and I was half asleep. And I started to think that I was sitting on a hill above a Jamaican marketplace, and the Jamaican market people and the peasants were down there laughing and talking. And to a very clear image I had. And based on what? Based on the sounds that was coming, the rhythms of the songs that were coming, certain songs which are clearly not Western, not English, not French, not German, not anything else. They were Jamaican to my ear. And the way, and a certain laughter, there was some laughter going on, and it was very Jamaican. And not just any Jamaican laughter, but country people, the peasantry. And I woke up, and here I am in the Paris airport. What the hell's going on? And then I heard the sounds coming from behind me. So I knelt upon the seat and peeked over. And there was a very obviously wealthy West African gentleman. I think he was obviously French, I believe, but he might not have been. But he was dressed in traditional robes, very spectacular traditional robes, which I didn't recognize. And his 3 wives were there. And there were 3 older wives, and they were, the guy was wealthy because these people were very lavishly dressed, and some of the wives had rings, gold rings on their toes, you know, you could see from the sandal, and the older wives. And then there was a younger wife, and she obviously was the youngest and the favorite. And the 3 older ones were teasing the old man, and teasing the younger wife. Obviously, they had given her some kind of present or something. And I didn't speak the language, I couldn't tell you what country they're from. But I'm there looking and listening. And there was a level of understanding from the sound, the tonalities, and you could read the situation. And I was laughing at certain times, and the older wife looked up and saw me laughing, and we're nodding, and we're laughing at the same time, sharing these jokes, the meaning, the literal meaning of which I didn't know, but the dynamics of which was clear.
So we're out of time. Thank you so much. The work has been fantastic tonight. That was really wonderful. Don't forget, there's still some